This podcast, the How to Protect the Ocean podcast, has always been a podcast for the people that want to learn about living for a better ocean and about the people who were out there working and protecting the ocean. It meant that I would help tell the stories or bring people on who worked in the same field who would tell their stories about protecting the ocean through marine conservation. But I came to realize recently that I learned a lot from you, the person listening to this episode, the person in my audience, on your challenges and successes on protecting the ocean during your daily life. You've DM'd me, you've emailed me, you've talked about the struggles, you've talked about the successes. It's always been inspiring to me. So I would like to invite you on the podcast to share your story to help your fellow audience members on how they could live for a better ocean. So listen to this episode to help find out how you can tell and share your story. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is a podcast where you find out what's happening in the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean. Now, if you don't know much about me, if you've just happened to come across this podcast or you've just started listening to this podcast, I'm going to remind you a little bit about who I am. So I am a marine biologist by education. I haven't practiced the field of marine biology, how a lot of people think about it in terms of research or conservation. However, I do conservation through science communication. I'm a marine science communicator right now. And for the last 8 years, that's what I've been doing. Almost 9 years now. That's what I've been doing. I've been communicating marine science and conservation through this podcast. Originally starting out as Speak Up for the Blue podcast, then it turned to Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast, and now it is How to Protect the Ocean podcast. And that evolution of the name really came to the evolution of how I wanted to present the podcast to people, right? When I first started talking about ocean conservation and science was more about, hey, I want to speak up for the ocean. I want to help the ocean, in terms of I wanted to explain it to people, what's going on in the ocean and how we can protect it, right? And so I did that through the stories of the people that I met at conferences and through my work. And they're amazing stories, stuff where they came from, what they were like, as people in the field and outside the field when they're not working, because that's who I got to know. These were my friends. These were my colleagues. These are the people I hung out with on a regular basis. And I found their stories interesting. It was fun to get to know them, and I wanted you to get to know them as well. And I did that. And we spoke up for the ocean. And then it started to evolve. And as I realized that people needed help and more guidance on, it was more about how to protect the ocean. The second name change was more about adding the word ocean into the name. And it wasn't necessarily more of an involvement of the messaging of the podcast, because it was just more for SEO purposes, search engine optimization purposes. I wanted people to know what the podcast was about. Speak Up for Blue was a little just too broad. So I wanted to add in ocean because Google started to come into the podcast world, and I wanted to add in ocean to get that search engine optimization, the search optimization. Like when you put in search, if you put in, I want an ocean podcast, I wanted my podcast to come up. So I put in the word ocean. That's that second name. But the third name was really an evolution of, I wanted to help you protect the ocean. And it still has to align with what when I first started the podcast, was telling the stories of the podcast, interviewing people, although I don't do it as much, interviewing people who are working within the field of marine science and conservation to show you what's happening, talking about news to show you what's happening, talking about how to protect the ocean in science communication, and then doing it, living for a better ocean. And that's where I started to realize last week I was on a trip. I was in the Dominican Republic. I was on a resort and I was sitting on the beach. I did lots of sitting on the beach. One of the things that I love when I go away and I'm near the ocean is I sit on the beach. In the last 2 years, I've gone to the same resort with my family. This time we brought friends along, family friends, and this was kind of fun. I had to go, I volunteered At this resort, if you wanted good beach chairs, lounge chairs, you had to get up early and reserve the chairs. Just put towels over the chairs. And it was pretty much an honor system. People wouldn't move the towels off the chairs. Or I never saw that. But I would get up early. And the last time I went a year ago, I had to get up around 7 o'clock. 7:15, I can put my towel on the chair. And what I would do is I would sit out there and I would read a book, or I would just sit out there and stare at the ocean, maybe take some pictures of the sunrise or the early sunrise. And I would enjoy that time. I would get my Blue Mind on. If you've ever read Dr. Wallace J. Nichols' book, Blue Mind, I highly recommend it. I would just sit there and I would just think about how happy I was to be around the ocean. Before I sat down, I would walk up to the ocean, I would put my feet in it, and then I would walk back. I'd stand there for a bit, then I would walk back, and I would sit down on my lounge chair, and I would just stare at the ocean. And I did a lot of that. I did this exact same thing this past week that I went, the same resort, same kind of deal. Actually, we had to get up earlier because I think people caught on. So I got up at 6:15, went down with my towels and my shirts and things like that, and I put down the chairs. We had more chairs to cover, to reserve, so we had 8 chairs to reserve. So I would, reserve 6 to 8 chairs depending on what we had. And I would put my shirt down. I'd put my shirt down and I would put my, towels down and books down and so forth to reserve the seats. And I would do the same thing. I would walk up to the ocean. I would put my feet in the ocean and I would just stare out. I would stare out at this vast, turquoise blue water, looking at the waves crashing in. They were pretty gentle most of the mornings, and enjoy a little bit of a breeze if there was one at the time, which there was for, I would say, most of the time. And it was just glorious. I would just stand there and I would just look at the ocean and feel the ocean between my toes and my feet, on my feet. And then I would go back and sit down. And I could have gone back to the room and I could have gone back and fallen asleep and waited till my family woke up and woken up with my family, gone to breakfast and do our whole routine. However, I stayed there and I would just stare. Sometimes I would read my book for like maybe 5 minutes, and then I would get distracted by the ocean again, and I would just sit there and I would stare. I'd take pictures of the ocean, I would stare, and I would just think about stuff. I would think about, and what I love when I'm around the ocean, I have a podcast on the ocean, I think about the podcast and how I can make it better. Not for me, not to gain more people in the audience. How could I make my podcast better for you? It's our podcast. It's a community podcast. I want people who are listening, I want you who's listening to this podcast to feel like you're a part of the community. I want you to say, hey, I really love hearing the stories that Andrew's telling me, but I really love this. I want to be a part of this community. And I think, the one thing about podcasting is that I am talking all the time, right? I'll have guests on and stuff and they do interviews and they do most of the talking, but let's be honest, most of the episodes, 3 per week, at least 2 of them, most time 3, I'm speaking. I'm talking to you because I'm dictating sort of what I think you should know, based on the stories, based on my advice and all that kind of stuff. And I've been doing it for almost 9 years. It's a long time listening to my voice. I appreciate it and I thank you for it. But it is a long time, hearing me talk to you about it. The calls to action, what you could do, hear some of the stories, this is what's happening, this is what I think you should do, this is what I think. It's always what I think. And I don't know, lately I've been trying to think about how I can change things up. At the beginning of the year, I came out with sort of goals and saying, hey, I want to tell more stories, more conservation stories. I'm still working on that. There's a bit of fear going in there. I'm still working on that. However, the other thing that came to me when I was staring at this water last week, in the heat, I'm in the shade, trying not to burn my skin, but I'm, feet are in the sand, cooling down. I'm staring out into the ocean by myself, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, what could I do to make this better? And for me, something that's always been great is hearing people talk about their journey, your journey. Not just conservation-wise. I don't want to hear always at the time, like, what you've been doing. It's always great to hear that, to make, to live for a better ocean. But I want to hear your journey. I want to hear where you're at. I want to hear what your struggles are. I want to hear what your successes are in living for a better ocean. Now, you've listened to this podcast. Some of you have listened to this podcast for the 9 years that I've been making this. Some of you listened to it for 5 years. Some of you 2 years. Some of you a month. Some of you even just today, you may have discovered this podcast. I'm like, what's this guy talking about? But on a podcast, I want to hear from you. I want to interview you. I want to interview people from my audience. So you who's listening to this right now, you might be walking your dog, you might be doing a workout, you might be on your commute to work or home from work. Who knows what you're doing? But I want to hear from you. I want my audience, I want everybody else in the audience, in this community, to hear from you on your conservation journey. So I am going to start a series. I don't know how long it's going to last, but I want to start a series on your journey. So I want to hear from you. I would like to invite you onto my podcast so that we can hear your journey to conservation. I want to hear from everybody across the board. I want to hear, if you're in South America, if you're in North America, if you're in Europe, if you're in Africa, Australia, Asia, I would like to interview you and we'll just have a conversation. There's no pressure. You do not have to be someone who is zero waste or anything like that. I want everybody. I want to hear from you because I want to share your story with the rest of the audience, with the rest of our community. Because I think if we start to hear from each other, you've heard from me plenty of times, if we start to hear from each other, then we can really rally around each other. We can really support each other. We can offer advice and we can listen to other people's advice. And maybe some of our stories are similar. We're like, oh, I've never thought about that tactic, or I've never thought about doing that. Oh, maybe that is easier than I thought. I want to hear from everybody so that we can share our stories and maybe inspire one another and maybe go out and help each other, right? Or even rally around each other and support each other. So this is a long way of me inviting you to come on the podcast and tell us your journey for living for a better ocean. You've heard my journey. You've heard the ups and downs and things. I want to hear your ups and downs. I want to hear how you feel about sort of the climate emergency that we're in. How do you feel about, what the politicians are doing, how oil and gas, projects are being, approved, the complexities of it, and how it affects your life, how it affects your family, how it affects your friends. I would love to hear from you. And I think it'll be a really fun thing to do, to hear everybody's story and support each other and rally around each other. For a while, I started a Facebook group, the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue community. And it's still going strong. I'm not in it as much as I used to be, and I'm not letting in people as much as I used to be. But I feel like I want to get some feedback. I want to hear from people. So I might start that up again. I might spend more time in there again. But I feel like that is important for us. I feel like we need to hear from each other, hear our voices, and hear how we speak, and hear how we all communicate and what we are doing in our conservation journey. So to do that, I'm going to put a link in the show notes. I would like you to click on the show notes if you're interested in being on the podcast. And there are times where I will be available. Book a time. It'll be about an hour. The episode will be like half hour, 45 minutes, but let's plan for an hour. And I will give you instructions on what we're looking for. Like I said, there is no pressure. I do not expect you to be, 100% zero waste and perfect eco-friendly person, because I'm not. What I'd like to do is get to know you, have our audience get to know you, but also talk about, how you feel about the podcast, how you feel about the messaging. Have you tried anything? Have you tried things that you haven't heard on this podcast? I would like to hear, what your life is like and how you're trying to live for a better ocean. and what's on your mind. Let's get to know each other. And so let's do that through the podcast. This is the best way of doing it. So I'm excited about this. I would love to hear from you. I've got a few people in mind that I might start off with and invite on, but I would love for you to volunteer your time and see what we can do. Anyway, I'm excited. I hope you click on that link. It's a Calendly link, and you just book your time, and we will have a great time at that. So that's it for today's episode. Again, your call to action. You don't have to DM me. You can if you want to ask me more details. But I want to hear from you. I want to get to know you, and I want our audience, our community, to get to know you as well. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. I hope to get to know you soon. I hope to talk to you soon. And thank you so much for listening. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.